My son-in-law scoffed, "You belong in a condo, not this zip code." Evelyn Carter, retired teacher and mother of his wife, said nothing. She just bought the house next door. Full price, no mortgage. The look on his face? Priceless. For years she'd been dismissed, underestimated, and talked over. Now she owned the address and the upper hand. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Elaine adjusted the collar of her pressed blouse as she stepped onto the slate-paved walkway of her daughter's new house. The sun was bright and heavy over Charleston that afternoon, drawing sharp shadows from the manicured shrubs flanking the front door. A wind chime jingled softly as Rachel opened the door, her smile tight, eyes already scanning behind her. "Mom, you made it!" Elaine leaned in for a brief hug, catching the faint scent of jasmine and floor polish. Wouldn't miss it. The interior was sleek, all gleaming hardwood, white walls, and expensive quiet. It smelled like money and newness, the kind that didn't grow on trees but on well-leveraged portfolios. A skylight poured golden light over a staircase with iron balusters that curved like a magazine spread. From the kitchen came the unmistakable pop of a wine cork. Greg appeared, barefoot on the marble floor, swirling a glass of Cabernet with theatrical ease. "Elaine," he said, voice light as he walked over. "Glad you could find it. GPS working on your flip phone these days?" She met his grin with practiced ease. "Still prefer paper maps. They never run out of battery." Greg chuckled, already pleased with himself. "Well, welcome to the neighborhood. Bit of a step up from your side of town, huh?" Elaine's eyes swept over the open concept living room. She noted the designer pendant lights, the 6-burner stove, the polished granite counters, and then the framed photo of Rachel and Greg on the Amalfi Coast, a life curated, filtered, and hung on walls like proof. Rachel walked ahead, gesturing toward the back deck. Greg had it expanded last month. The view of the harbor's incredible at sunset. "You should see the school ratings here," Greg said, sliding open the glass door. #1 in the Tri-County. Crime's practically non-existent. HOA keeps everything pristine. Elaine followed them outside, feeling the breeze shift over the water. The harbor shimmered in the distance, sailboats dotted like quiet punctuation. Greg handed her a glass of wine and nodded toward the neighboring homes, all clean-lined, 2-story monuments to wealth. "Places here go fast. Even the smallest lots are out of reach for most folks." Then he turned, resting an elbow on the railing. His voice dipped just enough to carry a personal sting. "This neighborhood is probably a little too expensive for you, Elaine." Rachel's smile faltered. Elaine didn't answer. She sipped the wine slowly, letting the silence stretch like pulled thread. A breeze stirred her silver hair, and she turned her gaze to the house next door. A slightly smaller property, half hidden behind an oak. Ivy curled around its white porch railing. The shutters needed paint, but it had charm. A soul. She looked back at Greg, her face calm. "Nice view," she said simply. Greg tilted his head. "It'll spoil you." Rachel shifted uneasily. "Mom, do you want to see the guest room? I had the bedspread changed. I thought you'd like the blue." Elaine smiled. "Of course, sweetheart." As they stepped back inside, Greg stayed behind on the deck, tapping at his smartwatch like the conversation had been a mild amusement. Inside the guest room, Rachel closed the door softly. "Sorry about him. He's just proud of the house." Elaine ran her fingers along the crisp edge of the dresser. "I noticed." Rachel hovered, biting her lip. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. Elaine looked at her daughter and saw the conflict there. Affection bruised by loyalty. She said nothing. Instead, she turned toward the window and took another look at the house next door. Its porch light flicked on as if in quiet answer. The next morning brought with it a heavy, sea-damp warmth that drifted through the open window of Elaine's modest kitchen. The breeze smelled faintly of pluff mud and crepe myrtle, and it stirred the edge of a grocery list taped to her fridge. She sat alone at the small table, wrapped in the hush of early hours, a mug of lukewarm tea resting beside a legal pad covered in tight handwriting. Numbers mostly, some circled, others crossed out with firm strokes. The comment Greg had made the night before still echoed in her chest like the aftermath of a dropped dish. Quiet, but jarring. Too expensive for you, Elaine. She didn't believe in anger as a strategy. Anger clouded details. But precision could move mountains. Or at the very least, doors. Her landline rang with its old-fashioned chime, and she answered quickly, her voice measured. Elaine Porter. Well, good morning to you too, came Martin Kemp's familiar southern drawl. Hope I'm not catching you before coffee. Elaine smiled despite herself. You're exactly on time. What's the occasion? I've got something that might interest you, he said, and she could hear papers being shuffled in the background. You remember that house next to Rachel's? The one with the porch wrapped in ivy? Word is it's about to hit the market. Owners moving upstate to be closer to family. Wants a discreet no-drama sale. Elaine's eyes lifted toward her front window, though the house he mentioned was miles away across the peninsula. Still, she could picture it vividly. The chipped shutters, the crooked charm, the overgrown garden whispering possibility. It's not officially listed yet, Martin continued, but I can get you in to see it before anyone else does. Quiet viewing, no realtors poking around yet. Her fingers brushed across the edge of her legal pad, hovering just above a line she'd drawn beneath the phrase, available liquid assets. How much are they asking? She asked, already pulling a file folder closer from beneath a stack of consumer reports. Low sixes, Martin replied. Honestly, not bad for that block. Small footprint, but solid bones. Garden outback's a mess, but you always did like a project. Elaine reached for a calculator, punching in a few numbers as she listened. The sum stared back at her. Enough. Not a fortune, but enough. I want to see it, she said finally, her voice calm but unwavering. Martin exhaled, pleased. Knew you'd say that. I'll set it up for tomorrow morning, early before the neighborhood starts buzzing. After they hung up, Elaine opened a manila envelope labeled Financials, Personal, extracting her pension statements, Social Security deposits, and modest brokerage account ledgers. Each figure lined up like quiet soldiers on a page. Years of discipline, of living modestly and investing wisely, had left her with something stronger than flash. Stability. She had never needed marble countertops or panoramic harbor views to feel proud of herself. She just needed the right door. A soft buzz broke the stillness, her cell phone, screen glowing with a new message from Rachel. Hey Mom, just FYI, Greg's talking about redoing the patio already, wants something statement-making, whatever that means might get noisy again soon. Elaine stared at the screen for a moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Then, with deliberate care, she locked the phone and placed it face down on the table. Let them have their statement patio. She had plans of her own. Later that afternoon, she made her way to Martin's office in the historic district, the kind of place with narrow sidewalks, window boxes bursting with begonias, and real brass doorknobs that clicked with satisfying weight. His office sat tucked between a law firm and a consignment shop, the window shaded by an awning faded from too many Charleston summers. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old books. Martin stood to greet her, waving her in with the same enthusiasm he used when announcing raffle winners at the Rotary Club. You're going to like this, he said, spreading out a few photos on the table. Porch needs scraping, kitchen's outdated, but it's got character, and the seller's willing to move quick. Elaine studied the photos carefully, noting the tilt of the shutters, the cracked stone path leading to the backyard, the slightly bowed floorboards near the entryway. I don't need perfection, she said quietly. I need a foothold. Martin leaned back, pleased. Well, this one's got good footing, and it's got your name written all over it. The lock clicked with a hollow sound, echoing faintly in the still morning air. Elaine stepped carefully over the threshold, her flats making a soft hush against the hardwood as she entered the house next door to Rachel and Greg's. It was quiet, but not in the cold, staged way that high-end homes often were. This house had a lived-in silence, the kind that settled after years of peace, not just a deep cleaning and a quick flip. Dust shimmered gently in the sunlight pouring through the tall windows, catching in lazy columns that stretched across the living room. The walls were painted a pale, buttery yellow, softened by time. She ran a hand lightly along the banister, the wood smooth and slightly warm beneath her fingers. Martin lingered near the door, clipboard in hand, but not rushing her. "She kept things simple," he said, his voice low. "Didn't chase trends. You can feel that, can't you?" Elaine nodded but said nothing yet. Her eyes scanned the trim, the baseboards, the quiet creak beneath her steps as she moved toward the kitchen. The room opened suddenly, brighter than she expected. The floor tiles were a faded checkerboard, ivory and slate, but the morning light made them glow. A window above the sink framed a tangle of garden beyond. Unruly roses, some overgrown herbs, a patch of lavender now gone wild. Even in its neglect, it bloomed with promise. Elaine placed her palm against the window frame, steadying herself just for a moment. She imagined planting tomatoes in the raised beds that had clearly been neglected for years. She imagined hearing the scrape of her trowel as she loosened soil that hadn't been touched since the previous owner packed up there last summer. She pictured stepping outside with a coffee in one hand and pruning shears in the other, trimming back the stubborn fig vine that curled along the back fence. "This kitchen's got good bones," Martin said quietly from behind her. "The listing will hit the network tomorrow, but we'll get your offer in early. Still," he paused, scanning the space with a realtor's practiced eye, "there's no guarantee. It'll move fast." Elaine turned, her arms lightly crossed as she absorbed the details. The antique light fixtures, the slightly bowed cabinet doors, the way the floor sloped just a little at the far end of the room. "How competitive?" she asked, though the firmness in her voice had already decided the answer didn't matter. "I'd say 3, maybe 4 offers, especially once it's public. This street gets attention." Martin tapped his clipboard. "But we'll come in clean. Pre-approval, no contingencies. That'll speak louder than flash." She offered a small nod. "Then speak it." They toured the rest of the house, 2 bedrooms upstairs with slanted ceilings and windows that let in the salt breeze from the harbor, and a narrow hallway closet that still smelled faintly of cedar. Nothing grand, but nothing false, either. When they stepped back out onto the front porch, Elaine paused again. Her hand rested lightly on the rail, the paint beginning to peel at the edges, and her eyes scanned the street. Charleston heat shimmered off the pavement as cicadas buzzed in the distance. Across the narrow lawn, the Wells house came into view. Greg stood on his driveway, arms folded across his chest. He wasn't wearing a smile this time, just a pair of wraparound sunglasses and an expression that twitched at the corner of his mouth like it wanted to be amused but couldn't quite get there. Elaine didn't wave. She didn't change her pace. She simply walked down the porch steps beside Martin and moved toward the sidewalk as if she hadn't noticed him at all. But she had, and he knew it. The ceiling fan in the downtown branch of First Federal spun slowly overhead, pushing air that smelled faintly of paper, ink, and old leather upholstery. Elaine sat across from James Dalton in his small office, the kind of banker who wore button-down shirts without jackets and always looked like he knew more than he was letting on. He adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on the polished oak desk. "You've kept your accounts tidy, Ms. Porter," he said, scanning the documents she'd brought. "0 liabilities, strong monthly pension, Social Security, brokerage balance is modest but healthy. This is all very solid." Elaine gave a polite nod. "I don't like debt, never have." "Well, that puts you ahead of half the county already," James replied, his tone wry but respectful. "You're not looking to finance the full amount?" "No." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'll pay cash up to a ceiling. I'd like to stay liquid enough for property taxes, renovations, and maybe a few surprises." He chuckled softly, flipping through the final pages. "That's Charleston for you. The houses smile politely and then show you where they creak." Elaine allowed a faint smile, though her eyes remained steady. She wasn't here for charm. She was here to win. Within the hour, the pre-approval letter was printed and slid across the desk in a crisp manila folder. James handed it to her with the kind of quiet formality bankers still observed for clients who didn't waste time asking for what they already owned. "Any questions for me?" he asked, capping his pen. "No," she said, rising. "But thank you, James. You've been efficient." "That's what we try to be," he replied. "And Ms. Porter?" She looked back. "You picked a good street." Elaine didn't respond. She simply gave him the kind of smile that didn't require follow-up, then turned and walked out into the humid afternoon. By mid-afternoon, she was seated across from Martin again, this time in the back corner of a coastal cafe near Broad Street, tucked beneath a whirring ceiling fan and the soft hum of a weekday lunch crowd. Martin set down a leather portfolio and opened it neatly, smoothing the draft offer across the tabletop. "I wrote it clean," he said. 20-day close, no financing, no inspections waived, but will accept as is on non-structural cosmetic issues. Seller disclosure looks honest. Elaine read through the pages silently, her eyes sharp as she moved line by line. She paused once, made a small mark, and passed the page back to him. "This clause on the seller not removing garden plantings, tighten it. I don't want to risk them digging up the lavender." Martin raised an eyebrow, then grinned. "You're already visualizing that yard, aren't you?" Elaine took the pen, positioned the offer where her name was typed neatly below the signature line, and signed it with a steady, fluid hand. She set the pen down with finality. "I'm not visualizing it," she said. "I'm securing it." Martin nodded with appreciation. "You'd make a hell of a poker player." "No," she replied. "I just don't bluff." As they stood to leave, her phone vibrated once inside her handbag. She ignored it until they reached the street, then pulled it out as they passed a bookstore window. Rachel. "Hey, are you at a bank? Greg said he saw you downtown earlier. Everything okay?" Elaine stopped on the sidewalk, reading the message twice. She could hear her daughter's voice in it, genuinely curious, tinged with confusion, but not yet concerned. She typed back a single message and stared at it for a moment before pressing send. "Everything's fine, just had a little business to take care of." The moving truck pulled onto the narrow street just after 8 in the morning, its diesel rumble echoing off the brick facades and pristine white shutters of the upscale harbor neighborhood. The driver in a faded ball cap leaned out to double-check the house number, then nodded and reversed with precision into the short gravel drive beside the ivy-wrapped porch. Elaine stood already waiting at the edge of the property, clipboard in hand, her short gray hair clipped neatly back, eyes calm but unflinching beneath the rising sun. She wore slacks, flats, and a white linen shirt. Nothing flashy, nothing out of place. Just a woman beginning a move. Or, to the less observant, continuing one. She checked her watch. On time. Just as she'd asked. The truck's back doors were thrown open, and soon a small team of movers began lifting carefully labeled boxes, each marked Charleston Townhouse, Porter, down the metal ramp. They worked quickly, navigating the low fence and uneven flagstones with a kind of silent rhythm only people who moved other people's lives for a living ever developed. Across the street, a black SUV door slammed shut. Greg stood in the driveway of his 2-story monument to himself, barefoot in basketball shorts and a Clemson t-shirt, holding a mug he hadn't yet taken a sip from. He squinted across the street, frozen for a long moment, as if his brain refused to interpret what his eyes were showing him. Elaine didn't look over. She lifted one hand in a slow, practical motion and pointed toward the garden gate. "That side entrance, please. I'd like the boxes stacked along the dining room wall." The movers nodded. No wasted motion, no time for confusion. From the front door of the Wells home, Rachel stepped out in a light robe, her expression mid-sentence. "Greg, what is—" Her words caught in her throat as she followed his line of sight. There her mother was, sleeves rolled, clipboard in hand, directing movers into the house they'd passed by 100 times. A house no one else on the block had shown the slightest interest in. Rachel's lips parted, stunned, but then, just slightly, curved. Not all the way, but enough. Greg walked halfway across his driveway, then stopped, shaking his head slowly like someone reading a memo written in a foreign language. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. This has to be a joke." One of the movers passed close to him with a box marked books, gardening/reference, and Greg took a step back, clutching his coffee like a shield. Elaine caught the moment from the corner of her eye but didn't respond. She was at the porch now, checking off the next item. "That one goes upstairs, second bedroom on the left," she instructed the young man carrying a garment bag. Neighbors had begun to notice. A woman walking her golden retriever slowed just slightly as she passed. 2 joggers paused at the corner, glancing toward the open truck. Across the street, blinds shifted in second-story windows. The neighborhood didn't gossip loudly, but it noticed everything. Greg finally broke his spell and turned back toward Rachel. "She's moving in next door," he said, voice sharp with disbelief. "She bought that place? That dump?" Rachel didn't answer. Her eyes were on Elaine, who was now unwrapping a small wind chime from newspaper and hanging it gently from the porch hook without hesitation. Greg stepped toward the sidewalk and muttered louder, "There goes the damn property values." Elaine looked up at him now for the first time that morning, her face calm as still water. "I guess you'll have to work harder on that statement patio," she said, voice even, eyes steady. "Make up the difference." Before Greg could respond, a small, well-dressed woman approached from the sidewalk, holding a clipboard of her own. She wore coral slacks and pearls, the kind of effortless Charleston style that had outlasted generations. Her posture was proud, her smile practiced. She stopped at the bottom of Elaine's steps and offered her hand. "You must be Elaine Porter. I'm Sylvia Howard, HOA president." Elaine took her hand without hesitation. "Nice to meet you, Sylvia." Sylvia's gaze flicked once toward Greg, then back to Elaine with a pleased gleam in her eye. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I think you're going to fit in just fine." The movers had finished before noon, their truck rumbling off down the block with a polite wave from the driver and a final clipboard signature. The heat had begun to thicken, the kind of Charleston humidity that clung behind your knees and settled into your collar, but Elaine stood untouched by it on her newly claimed porch, the wind chime gently tinkling behind her. Inside, boxes waited like unopened chapters, but she'd organized her morning with precision, and the next appointment was not one she planned to miss. Sylvia returned promptly at 12:30, just as promised, wearing a straw sun hat with a navy ribbon and carrying a bound packet in a neat leather folder. She stepped lightly up the porch steps and greeted Elaine with the kind of practiced charm that came from decades of bridge clubs, fundraisers, and private school auctions. "I brought you the HOA covenants," she said, offering the folder like it were a gift, not a rule book. "We try to keep things neighborly, expectations clearly outlined, and of course we're always open to discussion as long as it's reasonable." Elaine invited her to sit on the porch swing, wiping it down first with a small cloth she'd pulled from her pocket. She took the packet and opened to the first page, flipping slowly, reading with that same precise, methodical gaze she used in faculty meetings when someone tried to bury red flags in fine print. No structural changes without board approval, landscaping to be kept tidy and visually consistent with community standards, trash receptacles concealed from street view. Elaine nodded along as she scanned. Sylvia adjusted the brim of her hat. "We're not militant, dear. We just like to avoid surprises." Elaine didn't miss the emphasis on the last word. "I believe in structure," she said quietly. "Always have. People thrive in it." Sylvia gave a warm, knowing smile. "That's exactly what this neighborhood needs more of." Her tone remained pleasant, but her eyes sharpened just slightly as she leaned in. "Between us," she said in a confidential hush, "you may be interested to know your neighbor across the street hasn't exactly been model citizen material. We've had several complaints, minor noise violations, a landscaping contractor who started at 6 a.m. on a Sunday, and that unfinished patio eyesore sitting halfway built for weeks." Elaine didn't feign surprise. She simply turned another page in the packet and nodded again. "I saw the lumber stacked near the side gate." "Uncovered," Sylvia added, her mouth pinching just enough to reveal she'd already said as much in a board meeting. There was a small silence, filled only by the soft tap of palm fronds brushing against the side of the house. Elaine waited, letting the quiet sit until Sylvia filled it. "I'll be frank, Ms. Porter. This street, this community, works best when people pull their weight. You seem like the kind of person who does." Elaine closed the packet and rested it neatly on the swing between them. "I believe in pulling my weight," she said, "and I don't mind asking others to do the same." Sylvia's smile widened. "Then I believe we'll get along famously." Neither of them had noticed Greg stepping outside onto his front porch until he called across the lawn. His voice was falsely bright. "Everything all right over there?" Elaine turned just slightly in her seat. "Just going over the neighborhood rules with Sylvia." Greg offered a tight chuckle. You'll love it. So many rules to memorize. Sylvia stood slowly, adjusting her hat. We prefer to think of them as standards, Mr. Wells, and some people meet them a bit more naturally than others. Greg's jaw tensed, but he smiled anyway, not because he meant to, but because he had no idea what else to do. Elaine watched him a moment longer, then stood and extended her hand to Sylvia once more. Thank you for stopping by. I'll be sure to review everything tonight. Oh, take your time, Sylvia said as she descended the steps. But if you have any questions, especially about enforcement, I'm always available. The HOA clubhouse sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, tucked behind a screen of live oaks and flowering crepe myrtle, its white clapboard siding pristine and its blue shutters freshly painted. A brick path led from the small parking lot to a wide veranda, where neighbors mingled with lemonade cups and name tags already peeling at the edges. Elaine arrived 5 minutes early, her folder tucked under one arm, a simple blouse pressed crisp and her hair pinned neatly back. She walked into the room with quiet intention, offering polite nods and soft good evenings as she chose a seat near the center, neither buried in the back nor pushing toward the front. She didn't need to dominate the room, not yet. Across the space, Greg stood near the refreshment table, tossing a plastic stirrer in his coffee and laughing a little too loudly at something no one else seemed to find amusing. His outfit was louder than the conversation. A blazer over an untucked dress shirt, sleeves pushed up, designer watch glinting beneath the fluorescent lighting. He caught Elaine's arrival with a glance, blinked once, and turned away without a word. The meeting was called to order by Sylvia, seated at the head of the long folding table. Her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she tapped the gavel once, then smiled with the serenity of someone who controlled the thermostat, the minutes, and, more importantly, the tone. Thank you all for coming. We have a short but meaningful agenda tonight. I know there's been some discussion, on the forums and in some yards, about the upcoming outdoor projects in our neighborhood. She looked up briefly, her gaze drifting toward Greg, and some proposals have been submitted for review. Greg cleared his throat, stepping forward, a large folder in hand. If I may? Sylvia leaned back slightly, giving him the floor. Greg clicked a small remote, and a projector hummed to life behind him. The screen showed a series of glossy renderings, modern stonework, string lighting, a gas fire pit shaped like a sculpture, full outdoor kitchen with marble countertops. His voice shifted into pitch mode. We're proposing a full patio renovation, not just for personal use, he emphasized, but for elevating the overall aesthetic of our street. Property values, resale comps, it all benefits. This would set a tone. From the row ahead of Elaine, someone muttered under their breath, "Set the noise complaints more like." Another voice added, "Didn't you just tear up the last one last fall?" Greg pressed forward. "We'd be using premium materials, nothing that would clash with the neighborhood's palette. We're also hiring one of the best landscaping firms in the county. It's a multi-phase project, but I think once everyone sees the vision, they'll understand the value." Elaine sat still, letting the buzz rise, letting the questions bubble up around the room, about permits, about weekend construction noise, about the truckloads of supplies. And then, when the room settled back into an uneasy pause, she raised her hand. Sylvia gave a small, expectant nod. "Elaine?" Elaine stood slowly, unfolding a single sheet of paper she'd brought with her. "I'd just like to remind everyone that Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the HOA covenants sets clear limits on outdoor renovations, especially those involving gas lines, fixed lighting, or projects lasting more than 2 weeks without temporary screening." Several heads turned toward her. No tension, no theatrics, just facts. "And while everyone has the right to improve their home," she continued, her voice calm but resonant, "those improvements should be considerate of the whole community, not just property values, but peace of mind, morning routines, the sounds we come home to, the kinds of shadows we cast." The room held quiet after she finished. Not stunned silence, but something steadier. Agreement that didn't need applause to be real. Sylvia lifted her pen slowly, a small smile tugging at the edge of her mouth. "Thank you, Miss Porter." "That's noted." Greg shifted on his feet. "This was just a proposal. Nothing's been finalized." Sylvia nodded once, dryly. Indeed, and it won't be, not without full board approval. The sun had just begun to dip behind the houses across the street when Elaine knelt in the side garden, her gloved hands moving methodically through the soft earth. The heat of the day had broken at last, leaving behind a velvety dusk and the occasional whisper of salt air drifting off the harbor. She tugged gently at the roots of a stubborn weed, then loosened the soil around a freshly purchased rose bush, Queen Elizabeth pink, tall and stately, the kind that would bloom all the way through October if treated right. It had been years since she'd had a yard of her own, and even longer since anyone had asked her what she wanted to grow in it. Around her, the quiet wasn't empty, it was occupied. Cicadas chirped lazily in the trees. Somewhere down the block, a wind chime rattled, and from time to time footsteps passed by on the sidewalk. Neighbors who offered waves, small talk, or casual questions about what she was planting. "I remember when this garden used to have lilies," one older woman remarked from the gate, her dog tugging at the leash. "Glad to see someone's bringing it back to life?" Elaine smiled and dusted her gloves off. "Lilies take patience," she said. "Roses take commitment." The woman gave a knowing nod, as if those two sentences had answered something deeper. From across the street, Greg sat on his porch with a tumbler of something brown and sweating in his hand. He hadn't acknowledged her since the HOA meeting. Not with words, at least. But his presence lingered. She could feel it every time she stood in the yard. The weight of his eyes heavy behind dark sunglasses, the low drone of sports radio drifting just loudly enough to be heard but not challenged. He was waiting for her to do something petty, to slip, to misstep. But Elaine had no such intentions. Her roses were growing. That was enough. She was just rinsing her trowel at the spigot when the sound of hesitant footsteps came from the front walk. Turning, she saw Rachel approaching, holding a small plate wrapped in foil. She looked slightly flustered, hair pinned up haphazardly, sneakers unlaced, and her expression somewhere between hopeful and embarrassed. "Hi, Mom," she said, adjusting the foil. "I, baked. Kind of. They're muffins from a mix." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "Chocolate chip or blueberry?" Rachel peeled back a corner and smiled sheepishly. "Both. I couldn't decide." Elaine opened the screen door. "Then you made the right call. Come in." They sat on the porch just after the solar lanterns blinked on, 2 mugs of coffee between them, the muffins on a chipped plate from Elaine's kitchen unpacking. Rachel sipped slowly, her posture curled inward like she was still waiting for a lecture. "I didn't come over just for muffins," she said after a minute. "Greg's still sulking. Says the whole neighborhood thinks he's a clown now." Elaine didn't reply immediately. She lifted her cup and let the warmth settle against her palms. "Well," she said at last, "he did show up to a community meeting with a slideshow about a fire pit shaped like a sculpture." Rachel laughed before she could stop herself, then covered her mouth. "Sorry." Elaine smiled gently. "You don't have to apologize." Rachel grew quiet again. "He says you're making a point, that you're trying to prove something." Elaine turned her gaze toward the roses, their heads bobbing slightly in the breeze. "I'm not trying to prove anything," she said softly. "I'm just planting what I can and watching it grow." There was a long pause, filled only by the clink of a spoon against ceramic. "I don't know how to keep him calm," Rachel said finally, her voice barely above the wind. "He gets wound up and he takes it out on everything. On me. On himself." Elaine didn't flinch. She'd suspected for a long time that the tension inside their house ran deeper than casual arrogance or poor manners, but hearing it out loud shifted something. "You can't keep him calm," she said gently. "That's not your job." Rachel looked over at her, eyes shining slightly. "Then what is?" Elaine reached across and placed a hand over hers. "To keep yourself steady." It was a still, gray morning when Martin called. One of those low-pressure southern days where the air hung thick with warning, and even the birds seemed reluctant to speak. Elaine was standing in her garden, pruning back the rosemary when her phone buzzed in the pocket of her gardening apron. She tugged off her glove, brushed her fingers dry, and answered. "Elaine Porter." "Morning," Martin said. "Hope I'm not interrupting a date with the tomatoes." She smiled faintly. "You've got good timing." "Listen," he said, lowering his voice slightly. I was at a zoning review meeting this morning for a different client. Nothing to do with your street initially, but guess whose name came up on the residential noncompliance docket? Elaine straightened slowly. Greg. Ding ding, seems your son-in-law, or I suppose your neighbor, started his little patio makeover without filing proper notice. No structural application, no inspection scheduled, no environmental runoff permit for the new grading. Frankly, it's sloppy. A high school shop class would have covered more bases. Elaine walked toward the porch steps and sat down slowly, staring across the street at the neat stack of pavers Greg had lined against his house, now covered with a blue tarp. That explains the rush, she murmured. HOA's not even aware of half the changes he's making, Martin added. Might want to double-check the community rules. I can forward you the zoning map if it helps. Please do. She hung up, then walked back inside and retrieved the HOA binder from the sideboard drawer. She set it on the table like a reference Bible and flipped to the bookmarked section, Outdoor Modifications and Architectural Compliance. She read every line twice. Then she clicked her pen, turned to a clean sheet of stationery, and began drafting a letter. Not angry, not aggressive, but detailed. Specific. She attached a photo of the tarp-covered materials and quoted 3 provisions from the HOA charter, along with the relevant citations from city zoning codes Martin had sent her. She didn't add her name in bold. She didn't underline anything. She let the facts speak louder than opinion. The envelope was dropped in the HOA drop box by 3 p.m. sharp. By Friday, the project was halted. A notice appeared taped to the edge of Greg's fence. Construction cease order, in violation of Municipal Code, Section 14.3b. The contractors were gone by lunchtime, and the pavers stayed exactly where they were, now damp from a steady drizzle and gathering pine needles like abandoned luggage. Elaine pretended not to notice, though the neighborhood certainly did. As she trimmed her roses that evening, she overheard snippets of conversation drifting from passing strollers and joggers. That's the new neighbor? Caught it in 1 week flat. Sharp as ever. You'd think she'd been here 10 years. Elaine worked quietly, a faint smile tucked behind her lips. But across the street Greg was pacing. It wasn't until Sunday morning that Rachel knocked. She didn't bother texting first, just showed up, hair pulled back, sweatshirt too big, hands stuffed in her pockets like she didn't know what to do with them. Elaine opened the door without hesitation. Come in. Rachel followed her into the kitchen and stood awkwardly at the counter. Elaine poured her a cup of tea without asking. I wanted to ask you something, Rachel said softly. You know about zoning, don't you? Elaine nodded once. I do now. Rachel's shoulders dropped, a silent exhale. They shut it down. The patio. Greg is livid. He's blaming the HOA, the city, everyone but himself. Elaine said nothing. She sipped her tea and waited. I asked him what contractor he'd used. Rachel continued. He got defensive. Then weird. I checked the joint account this morning. Her voice cracked just slightly. Almost 15 grand is gone. Elaine looked up, her expression suddenly very still. Rachel nodded. He used our money, without telling me, said he'd put it back before I noticed. Like it was nothing. There was a long pause. Rachel sat down at the kitchen table and stared at her hands. I'm tired of pretending we're fine. Elaine reached out and gently took her daughter's hand in both of hers. I know, she said. You don't have to anymore. The sky had turned a soft, sullen gray by the time Rachel came back. It was late afternoon, and Elaine had just finished watering the roses when she heard the front gate click. She looked up to see her daughter standing there again. Same sweatshirt, same weary eyes, but something deeper had shifted this time. Her hands weren't just in her pockets. They were clenched into quiet fists. Elaine met her at the door without a word. Inside, the kitchen held the same soft order it always did. The clean counters, the quiet tick of the wall clock, the scent of mint from the small pot on the windowsill. Rachel stepped in like someone tiptoeing into a memory they hadn't visited in years. Elaine set the kettle on the stove, then turned to her daughter. Tea again? Rachel hesitated, then shook her head. Actually, coffee, if you have it. Elaine nodded, wordless. She pulled out the tin of ground beans, filled the filter, and let the gentle percolation fill the space between them. Neither of them rushed. They didn't need to. When the coffee was ready, Rachel took the mug in both hands but didn't drink. She sat down at the kitchen table like gravity had just caught up with her. "I didn't tell you everything," she said finally, her voice quieter than the room required. Elaine sat across from her. "It wasn't just the joint account. He emptied out one of the savings CDs too, broke it early. There's a penalty for that, you know?" Elaine said nothing, just listened, eyes steady and kind. Rachel's jaw clenched. "And when I asked him why, he told me I wouldn't understand the long-term play, that this was an investment, that I should be grateful he was thinking ahead." A sharp silence followed, the kind of silence where shame and rage sit beside each other, waiting for someone else to break first. Elaine reached across and gently touched her daughter's wrist. "Did you know what was happening before you checked the balance?" Rachel looked down at her hands. "I think part of me did, but I didn't want to believe it. I kept brushing off the red flags, the attitude, the secrecy, the guilt-tripping." She gave a bitter laugh. "You know he still hasn't said sorry? Not once. Just keeps trying to distract me with other problems. Blames you, blames the HOA. Hell, he blamed the weather this morning." Elaine tilted her head slightly, her voice even. "He's trying to keep you in motion. If you stay angry, you won't stop to think. If you're too busy reacting, you don't have time to ask what you really want." Rachel looked up. "And what if I don't know what I want?" Elaine smiled softly. "Then you're closer than he is, because at least you're asking." A tear slipped down Rachel's cheek, and she wiped it quickly with the edge of her sleeve. "I don't know how to be alone," she whispered. "Not really. Not since college. Greg's always been there. Even when he wasn't showing up right, he was showing up loud." Elaine let that hang in the air. Then she stood, crossed the room, and opened the kitchen cabinet above the sink. From the top shelf, she pulled down a small ceramic jar, hand-thrown, blue-glazed, with a crack running down one side. She placed it in front of Rachel. "What's this?" "I made that my first year teaching," Elaine said. "Didn't know a thing about pottery, but I wanted something of mine, something small and sturdy and only mine. It held pens for 20 years, then seeds. Now it holds tea bags." Rachel ran her fingers along the crack in the glaze. "I've never had something that was only mine," she said. Elaine met her eyes. "You still can." Rachel's voice cracked as she leaned forward and wrapped her arms tightly around her mother's shoulders. Not tentative, not polite. A full-bodied, breath-catching embrace, the kind that said more than words ever could. Elaine closed her eyes and held her daughter like she had when she was small and couldn't fall asleep during thunderstorms. The sun was still low when Greg's voice cut across the street like a blade through fabric. Elaine had just finished placing a fresh layer of mulch around the roses when she heard the door to the Wells house swing open with the kind of force that made screen doors groan. She looked up just as Greg stormed out, barefoot again, wearing last night's t-shirt and a rage that had clearly been marinating for hours. He didn't walk over right away. He paced, up and down his own driveway, jaw clenching, hand gripping the back of his neck like it might stop his thoughts from escaping his mouth. It didn't. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" he shouted suddenly, voice cracking through the morning stillness. "You had to move in, had to start planting yourself right in the middle of our lives, like you belonged here." Elaine didn't flinch. She stood up slowly, brushing her gloved hands together, then walked toward her porch steps with quiet, measured steps. Greg kept going, each sentence louder than the last. "She's my wife, not your puppet. You think you're helping, but you're just making her feel sorry for you, like she owes you something." Elaine reached into her gardening apron and, without looking, pressed the small black button on the voice recorder clipped inside the inner pocket. It had belonged to her back in her teaching days, an old habit she'd kept in case meetings ever turned pointed, and this one was headed there fast. "You turned her against me," Greg bellowed. "She was fine before you got involved. We were fine. You don't know what the hell you're doing." Across the street, a neighbor walking their spaniel paused mid-step. From the corner house, blinds shifted. 2 joggers slowed near the stop sign. The block had gone still, not curious but watchful. Elaine stepped onto her porch and met his glare without raising her voice. "I haven't turned Rachel against anyone," she said evenly, "but you seem to be doing a fine job of it yourself." That only made it worse. "She moved in with you," he shouted, gesturing wildly toward the house. "Like some pathetic little refugee, you're feeding her your poison, making her think I'm the villain." Elaine's fingers stayed closed around the recorder, her posture calm and rooted. But behind her, the screen door creaked open. Rachel. She stood there in one of Elaine's sweaters, arms folded tight against her chest, face pale but firm. "Greg," she said quietly, but he didn't stop. "I have given everything to this marriage," he raged, spinning back toward her. "You don't even get it. I work my ass off, I try to give you a life, and this is the thanks I get? You run away to your mother's house like a child?" Rachel took a step down, barefoot on the porch wood, her voice soft but cutting. "I ran away from you." Greg froze. "You don't hear yourself anymore," she said, "but everyone else does." He blinked. Around them, the street was completely still. Realizing the audience he'd built, Greg exhaled sharply, then turned on his heel and stormed back inside his house, slamming the door hard enough that the shutters rattled. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, then slowly sat on the top porch step, her face blank. Elaine walked over to her and offered a hand. They didn't speak for a while. Later that day, Elaine took a short walk down to the HOA clubhouse where Sylvia was sorting donation envelopes from last weekend's garden fundraiser. She looked up as Elaine entered and raised a curious eyebrow. "I brought you something," Elaine said, slipping the recorder across the desk. Sylvia pressed play. The room filled with Greg's voice, sharp, frantic, unhinged. His words echoed off the walls, each one worse than the last. By the time it ended, Sylvia didn't look up right away. Finally, she took off her glasses and folded them neatly. "Well," she said, sliding the recorder back across the table, "that'll matter." The wind had picked up by the time Elaine stepped out of the ride-share on Queen Street, the wide oaks overhead shifting and whispering in the late-morning breeze. A single gull wheeled over the rooftops as she adjusted the collar of her jacket and made her way up the front steps of an old brick building that had once been a bank, now repurposed into offices for one of the city's quieter law firms. Inside, the reception area smelled faintly of lemonwood polish and fresh paper. The walls were lined with tidy framed prints of Charleston's courthouse architecture, and a ticking brass pendulum clock punctuated the hush with slow ceremonial rhythm. Elaine was greeted with a warm, professional nod by the assistant and was quickly ushered through a frosted glass door into a windowed office at the end of the corridor. Evelyn Marchand stood as she entered, a woman in her early 60s with slate-gray hair pulled into a loose twist, glasses perched low on her nose, and a voice that carried the deliberate calm of someone who'd handled dozens of wills, divorces, and family trusts without ever once misplacing a clause. "Good to see you again, Elaine," Evelyn said as she gestured to the seat opposite her desk. "You're still the only client I have who brings notes printed on college-ruled paper." Elaine smiled and placed the folder on the table. "Old habits die hard. I spent 30 years reading high school essays. Margins comfort me." The two women exchanged a look, and then Evelyn turned her attention to the set of documents already arranged on the desk. Her fingers skimmed across the stack until she settled on the revised will draft. She tapped once, delicately. "Everything you requested has been included. The new clause excludes Gregory Wells from any inheritance, executor rights, or spousal claim in the event of Rachel's passing. And your language regarding non-consideration due to conduct is in place. It's airtight." Elaine gave a quiet nod. "Good. I don't want him touching a dime. Not now. Not after." Evelyn adjusted her glasses. "The trust for Rachel remains active, with annual distributions and oversight, but I've included the option to accelerate disbursement if she files for legal separation or divorce. That gives her agency if she chooses it. And the educational donations?" Elaine reached into her handbag and passed over a smaller envelope, handwritten on soft cream paper. "Half to Mitchell Elementary, the other half to Liberty Grove Middle School. I don't want my name on a plaque. Just give the funds to their principals and let them decide what the students need." Evelyn took the envelope with a slow nod. "They'll appreciate that more than you know." The final documents were slid across the desk for signature. Elaine read every word again, not out of distrust, but ritual. Her eyes moved steadily across each section until she reached the last page, where her name waited in neat block lettering. She signed with the firm, looping grace of someone who had once signed hundreds of permission slips, discipline reports, and graduation diplomas. When it was done, Evelyn sat back and gave a small, approving nod. It's good work. Honest work. Elaine exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. It feels like closing a drawer that's been stuck open for years. Outside, the rain had just begun. It wasn't heavy yet, just a soft mist that danced across the stone steps as Elaine exited the building and turned left, her heels tapping on the slick sidewalk. Instead of heading straight home, she followed the curve of the historic district's narrow streets until she reached the Battery. The harbor stretched wide and gray in front of her, and the air smelled faintly of wet stone, salt, and the distant trace of jasmine that still clung to a wrought iron fence nearby. She paused along the low seawall, hands resting on the cool stone, watching the slow, rhythmic movement of the water below. Everything felt quieter now, not because the world had changed, but because she had. She had done something permanent, something rooted. She had made sure that when she was gone, her name would outlive the bitterness, the small-mindedness, the noise, not through vengeance, not through spectacle, through intention, through clarity. The guest room smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar, the way a quiet, clean room always does when it's been made ready, not just tidied, but offered. Elaine had ironed the sheets earlier that morning, smoothing each corner with care, and set a small ceramic dish on the nightstand to hold earrings or loose change. A second pillow had been added, and by the window she'd placed a simple glass of water and a paperback Rachel used to love in college. When Rachel stepped in, suitcase in hand, there was no announcement, no breakdown, no ceremony. Just a nod, a quiet exhale, and the low scrape of the suitcase wheels as she pushed it gently over the threshold. Elaine didn't say anything right away. She just stood beside the door, letting her daughter have the first moment alone in the space. When Rachel finally turned around, her face looked both tired and strangely lighter, like someone who had come inside from a storm, soaked through but finally dry. "Thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Elaine smiled. "The closet's empty. Use what you need." Across the street, Greg's house looked unchanged, but Elaine had learned to read the silences of that place. There were no morning jogs to the car, no click of Rachel's heels on the porch, no gardening crew or patio deliveries anymore. Just the occasional flicker of a television behind closed curtains, and once, early in the morning, the unmistakable sound of a glass bottle tossed too hard into a recycling bin. He hadn't spoken to either of them in days. Inside the kitchen, Elaine had pulled out a yellow legal pad and 2 sharpened pencils. Rachel sat at the small table, hair pulled back, reading glasses perched low. Together, they listed out expenses. Things Rachel hadn't looked at in years. Student loan residue, automatic deductions she hadn't realized Greg was controlling, credit lines she now needed to separate. Elaine didn't judge. She didn't even offer commentary. She just drew columns, lined up numbers, and helped Rachel circle what could be cut and what needed attention. "You'll be all right," she said, tapping the pencil gently against a small monthly subscription for Greg's golf app. "You've already done the hardest part." Rachel gave a half smile, tired but grateful. "Feels like there's still a mountain ahead." Elaine looked up, her voice quiet but certain. "Yes, but now you've got boots on." That afternoon, while Rachel was on a call with the bank, Elaine stepped out onto the porch to water the hanging baskets. Sylvia appeared a few minutes later, coming up the walk with her usual bright lipstick and a clipboard under her arm, though she didn't look like she was on official business. "Thought I'd check in," she said. "You've had a busy month." Elaine wiped her hands on a towel and nodded. "More eventful than I'd planned." Sylvia leaned against the porch rail, eyes flicking briefly across the street. "Most people would have lost their temper by now, or at least made a scene. You held the line." Elaine shrugged gently. "I've learned the loudest person is rarely the one still standing at the end." Sylvia smiled, and it wasn't the polished HOA smile. It was something older, quieter, the kind reserved for someone who's earned it. "I hope she knows what she has in you," Sylvia said, glancing toward the guest room window. Elaine followed her gaze but didn't respond. Not out loud, but her face softened. Later that evening, Rachel came out to the porch with a mug of tea and sank into the swing beside her mother. The cicadas had started up again, and the street was bathed in that familiar Charleston twilight, pink gold air and the sweet hush of homes settling in. "I feel free," Rachel said suddenly, the words falling out like a truth she hadn't planned to say, and a little scared, but mostly free. Elaine reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's cheek. "That's how you know you're not going back." They sat in silence after that, just the two of them, rocking gently beneath the porch light. Then Elaine's phone buzzed against the armrest. She glanced down at the screen. Martin Kemp. She answered with a quiet, "Hello," her voice steady. Martin didn't waste time. "Corner of Bay and Sycamore, just hit the private listings. Bigger than your place, wraparound porch, deep lot, needs cosmetic work, but the bones are excellent." Elaine leaned back in the swing. "What's the ask?" "High sixes," he replied, "but negotiable, and you'd be first in." Elaine turned toward Rachel, who was watching her, curious. "Is it for me?" Rachel asked. Elaine smiled faintly, then shook her head. "No," she said, "but maybe it's for both of us." The morning was crisp with early sunlight when Elaine and Rachel pulled up in Martin's car. He had insisted on driving, claiming the gravel near the corner lot was still too soft for low-profile tires. The house stood at the far end of Bay Street, where the live oaks opened just enough to frame the harbor like a painting. Even at a glance, it looked like something from a forgotten novel. Wraparound porch, slate-gray shutters, wide dormer windows that blinked quietly at the world. Elaine stepped out slowly, sunglasses on, cardigan folded over her arm. Rachel stood beside her, silent for a beat too long, until she let out a breath that caught at the end. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh my God." The house had that rare kind of presence, not showy or precious, but dignified. Its paint was chipped in places, vines curled along the east-facing rail, and the back fence leaned just slightly from age. But it stood without apology. It had stood for years. It would stand for years more. Martin unlocked the front door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let them through. "The floors are original," he said, "but reinforced. The last owner refinished them a decade ago, kept the creak in the boards but took out the splinters." Elaine smiled as she stepped across the threshold, feeling the give beneath her feet. The foyer was wide and bright, and the walls smelled faintly of cedar and old lemon oil. She didn't need to be told what could be updated or replaced. She didn't need the specs. She walked the space like a memory she hadn't made yet. Rachel lingered behind, eyes trailing over the wide banister, the transom windows, the antique light fixture hanging slightly off-center. "This is—" she began, but stopped herself. Martin gave her a glance. "It's a lot of house," he said gently, "but not too much for the right person." Elaine ran her hand along the hallway molding. "Let's see the kitchen." They toured the space room by room, sunroom, back study, upstairs bedrooms that smelled faintly of sea air. The kitchen needed work, but the bones were good. So was the light. There was a back door that opened onto a patchy garden and an old brick patio half swallowed by overgrown mint. Rachel stepped through it all in quiet awe. "You could fit a whole life in this place," she said. Elaine looked at her, then out at the wild edge of the yard. "I think I might." Martin raised an eyebrow. "You want to wait? Sleep on it? Maybe come back after the painters finish the corner trim?" Elaine shook her head. "No." She turned toward him, her expression firm, eyes lit with something Rachel hadn't seen in a long time. "Make the offer. Full price. No contingencies. Tell them we'll cover the title fees if they close in under 30 days. Martin gave a slow nod, impressed. "You're not one to hesitate, are you?" Elaine looked around the room one more time, then turned back toward the front door. "Not anymore." Word spread fast. By late afternoon, 2 neighbors had already walked past Elaine's porch with veiled congratulations. "Quite the move," one said with a practiced smile. "That's the biggest lot on Bay." Elaine only nodded, offering her usual serene wave. She didn't need their approval. She hadn't asked for it. Across the street, Greg stood stiff on his porch, arms folded tight, jaw working like he had something to say but no audience left to hear it. He watched Rachel carry in a basket of fresh towels, her ponytail swinging as she disappeared inside Elaine's house. He didn't wave. Elaine didn't either. That evening, with the sun setting low and pink behind the chimneys, Elaine brought out a tray with 2 tall glasses of sweet tea and a small bowl of lemon slices. Rachel joined her on the porch swing, curling her bare feet beneath her and lifting her glass with a quiet grin. "2 old houses," she said. Elaine clinked her glass lightly against Rachel's. "And better foundations." They drank in silence, the sound of crickets rising in the hedges, the porch fan whirring softly above them. Just as the lanterns clicked on, Elaine's phone buzzed once in her lap. A text from Martin. "Offer accepted. They'll vacate in 3 weeks. Congratulations, homeowner." Elaine smiled faintly, then tilted her glass toward the darkening sky. There was still more to build, but for the first time in a long time, they had space to do it. The first morning in the new house arrived gently, like a soft knock on the back door. Elaine stood barefoot on the wraparound porch, a steaming cup of black tea in her hand and the faint scent of salt on the breeze. The roses she'd transplanted from her old yard were already adjusting, buds beginning to open along the lattice she'd tucked against the eastern fence. She made sure to water them early, before the heat settled in. A little care, a little patience. It went a long way. The house had come alive faster than anyone expected. In just under a week, Elaine had cleared the back patio, reshelved the small study, and hung the wind chime from her previous porch on a rusted hook that caught just enough of the evening breeze. A new rhythm was forming, slower, quieter, but fuller. Inside, Rachel sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a legal notepad full of crossed-out names and dates. Her attorney had started the divorce filings 2 days ago. It was early in the process, messy, procedural, but she was facing it, signature by signature. Elaine poured a second cup of tea and slid it across the table. "Still holding up?" she asked, gently. Rachel exhaled, rubbing the back of her neck. "I didn't realize how many forms it takes to let go of something that never really held me back." Elaine smiled. "Letting go's heavier than it looks." Rachel offered a tired nod, but her eyes had that new sharpness, clearer now, like someone learning to breathe differently after years of shallow air. That afternoon, Elaine went for a walk. She wore her wide-brimmed sun hat, linen slacks, and a light scarf around her neck. Not for vanity, but because she'd always believed in presenting oneself with intention. The neighbors, now familiar, waved as she passed. One woman, Nancy from 2 doors down, stepped off her porch to compliment the lavender Elaine had added to her walkway. "It smells like spring again," Nancy said with a wink. "I used to have some before the deer ate it all." Elaine smiled. "They don't like rosemary. Plant it alongside. It teaches them manners." Nancy laughed, and the sound lingered warmly as Elaine continued on her route, past houses where shutters had been freshly painted and porch swings newly hung. There was a quiet pride among these homes, the kind that didn't beg for attention but noticed everything. And now it noticed her. By the time she returned home, there was a note tucked into her mailbox, a handwritten card from Sylvia on stiff ivory paper. "On behalf of the HOA board, thank you for setting such a steady tone on Bay Street. Your clarity and presence have been a gift. No signature needed." Elaine tucked the note into a drawer with her receipts and gardening catalogs, then returned to the kitchen to begin preparing a small pitcher of lemonade. That evening, with the sun low behind the palms, Elaine set out a few folding chairs on the porch and arranged slices of lemon in shallow bowls beside the glasses. It wasn't an event. Not officially. Just a small porch party. Just neighbors stopping by as they passed. Nancy brought cookies. A retired couple from the corner brought lawn peaches and stories about the time the street lost power during a thunderstorm, and everyone gathered by candlelight. Rachel brought her smile, wider now, easier. They sat and sipped and let the conversation drift like music, soft and unhurried. At one point, someone started laughing about a stray cat that kept sneaking onto their patio cushions. That laugh was answered, then echoed, until the sound stretched out across the block, carried by the harbor breeze. Greg's porch light flicked on once across the street, then flicked off again. No one noticed. Rachel came and sat beside her mother on the swing, legs tucked underneath her. The sky was bruised gold and pale lavender, and the wind carried that faint, unmistakable scent of sea and soil. "I like it here," she said. Elaine didn't reply right away. She took another sip of her tea and looked out toward the waterline, where dusk gathered in soft folds. "Me too." The porch light clicked on above them, casting a warm halo that made the shadows lean back. Elaine glanced at the second set of keys now resting in the small ceramic bowl by the door, silver, smooth, and newly cut. She reached over, clinked her glass lightly against Rachel's, and let herself smile. The view was sweeter with two sets of keys.